Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
You can tell a lot about where a company is going by looking at where it's been. ConocoPhillips, Alaska's oil and gas company.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service. It is the 11th of December, and as always, and every night we tell you, please take a look at our website, weather.gov, or if you'd like to look at the entire state of Alaska all at once, arh.noaa.gov. If you click on Alaska, that'll take you to the nearest Weather Service office that serves your village and community, and you'll get more local weather information, observations, and a look into the next 7 days that way anytime you like. Go ahead and bookmark that once you find the right spot. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You can dial a forecast that way. If you save those numbers, you'll get back to the right spot fairly quickly as well. Find us on Twitter under NWS Anchorage, NWS Juneau, or NWS Fairbanks. Also NWS Alaska to get kind of a select view of statewide issues there. We're also on Facebook under U.S. National Weather Service Alaska. In the afternoon under youtube.com/NWS Anchorage. You get that short statewide briefing like what you hear on your public radio station in the afternoon and early evening. And then after the show on Alaska Public, you can find the entire broadcast, what you're watching right here. Go back and watch it again if you like. Here's a look at the hazardous weather situation. Across southeast, we have had plenty of snow across the Klondike Highway area already. Some places up to about 10 to 18 inches of snow, I believe, with, in general, another 1 to 2 feet of snow expected by tomorrow afternoon. So by this time tomorrow, another 1 to 2 feet of snow possible for areas that could include Juneau all the way up to the Klondike Highway and Taya Inlet regions. And certainly looking at some heavy snow conditions there, all the northern Gulf Coast shores, including areas around Yakutat. All those areas under a winter storm warning, with the exception of the Taya Inlet and Klondike Highway areas that are looking at blizzard warnings. So a lot of moving air through that region as well. A pretty steep northerly gradient working across the northern parts of southeast. And as such, again, some heavy snow and in some cases some strong wind moving that around. And heavy snow also expected around parts of the higher terrain of southeast Alaska, which does include places near Ketchikan and Hyder as well, where it's been snowing pretty consistently. Now, just below that in the lower terrain, there's a lot of heavy rain, so there is a lot of warm and wet air parked right about here, but everything else is cold enough for that heavy snow to continue. We're looking at some winter weather advisories for the Copper River Basin due to wind chills and also some blowing and drifting snow in some cases there. A little bit farther north, it's mainly the moving air that's causing the issue. Wind chill issues could drop that feels like factor down to about 35 or 40 below. So if you're in the middle Tanana Valley, the lower Tanana Valley, all the way to the Yukon Flats and up around Bettles, again, that means you. And again, some blowing and drifting snow, especially along the highway summits, could be an issue as well. We've seen a lot of moving air across south central Alaska today produce some pretty strong gusts, and we're setting up the weather pattern to change that up just a little bit here in probably the next few days. At the end of the week into the weekend, this weather maker here that's been moving and just skirting the Aleutians will make its way into the Gulf, and it will start to change the weather pattern up just a little bit to make snow a little bit more of a reality for south central Alaska perhaps. But there's several other waves back to the west that have attached themselves to moisture and will try and influence the overall Alaska weather pattern in the coming several weeks. But if you watch right here, you can see this very large comet shape. That is the overall low pressure system that's on the western side of high pressure that is producing quite a bit of cold now and is really trying to make its cold stable across Alaska there. So we'll look at that weather pattern here in just a minute. But the big guy in town is this one here, just to the west of the Kamchatka Peninsula and across the continent of eastern Asia. As you look at the weather pattern across Alaska, here is the weather maker now that's really bringing the snow to southeastern Alaska. This low here is mainly west and southwest of Sitka. It has a number of frontal boundaries attached to it here, as you'll see in just a minute. The main forcing is bringing that wet and warm air to central and southern parts of coastal southeast. That's rain, but at the higher terrain and mainly from, let's say the Lynn Canal and maybe just south of Juneau and points north, there's some pretty heavy snow going on. Now, that was a pretty big generality for a pretty large map here. If you're in southeast, that line is going to shift north and south and probably east and west a little bit. So if I didn't name your village there, don't be surprised if you do get snow or if you don't get snow. And you'll want to check in with weather.gov/Juneau to get the very finite details of what's going on in your very specific area. As we all know, southeastern Alaska is a terribly complicated place to forecast for. And looking a little bit farther west, with low pressure here, we're getting a pretty strong draw across the northern parts of the Gulf. Mother Nature abhors a vacuum, more or less hates a vacuum. We have high pressure to the north parked across the Arctic coast and the slope, and we have low pressure here. So all that air is trying to fill in a pretty big void in the atmosphere right about here. Well, that's drawing that wind through the Cook Inlet. It's drawing it into the Klondike Highway area and the passes there, and all of that is creating pretty steep gradient across the Mat-Su Valley. And as many of you experienced in Mat-Su today, including Palmer and Wasilla, some of those gusts reach upwards of 55 to maybe 62 miles per hour. So not only is it colder, but the wind chill value dropped, and it has been rather blustery. That's going to continue for you tonight and into at least the first half of tomorrow before it starts to taper off. Wind also an issue across the central parts of the interior today. Look at the packing of these gradients. This is a plot of constant pressure. Each one of those lines is an isobar, and so the tighter packed they get, the faster the wind's going to want to move along that pattern. So we've got a lot of wind just trying to fill into low pressure here from high pressure up across the north. Pockets of light snow across Cape Newingham. Also across the Aleutians, we're looking at some light rainfall today. The main weather maker again across the northern and eastern Gulf with high pressure just sitting tight, sitting pretty across the east and southeastern parts of the Yukon, northern British Columbia, and the Arctic coast at 1,042 millibars. Blowing and drifting snow certainly possible across the interior tonight and again tomorrow with low pressure working its way up toward Yakutat. Again, that boundary between rain and snow is going to be a pretty sharp one there, so that may waffle around and waver around a little bit in parts of southeast, but it does look like the northern third of the archipelago is probably looking at another 1 to 2 feet of snow by tomorrow afternoon. That frontal boundary kind of parks, throws on the brakes for tomorrow afternoon, and that means the wind's going to continue, especially across northern parts of southeast. Heavier rainfall a little bit closer to the Dixon entrance and some higher seas as a result of some of the stronger winds there. And we're still looking at some gusty winds across the western parts of the Kenai Peninsula and into the Mat-Su, but that should really taper off tonight and into early parts of tomorrow morning. Blowing and drifting snow still possible across the central interior with the winter weather advisory expiring by early tomorrow morning, and pockets of snow there from Bristol Bay out across the Aleutians. Most of that should be light. To watch for areas of fog and low clouds there into the Bering Strait and also across the Chukchi Seacoast. As the frontal boundary moves into southeast, the low pressure system's moving back to the west. That could offer up some light snowfall opportunities for Thursday night into Friday for parts of south central Alaska, and an increasing chance as we head into the weekend. We'll be watching that, as you will be as well. 30s and 40s across parts of southeast today. It was Hyder that checked in at 48 degrees by late afternoon. 20s and 30s across Prince William Sound, Middleton Island, Kodiak in the mid-30s this afternoon. Talkeetna saw temperatures in the low to mid-20s. Many areas up there looking at some pretty nasty wind chills as we head into tonight. Areas around Fairbanks at or even below zero if you get out toward Greeley, 8 below. 31 below around Eagle today. That, thankfully, in the late afternoon was with a calm wind or no wind at all. A pretty stable air mass there, so not a whole lot of air moving around at that point. 8 below in Fort Yukon, Amblers and Bettles, both looking at 9 below, 24 below in Arctic Village, and the North Slope anywhere from 2 below in Kaktovik to about 23 below in Atkasuk. Looked like Nuiqsut was about 15 below, Prudhoe Bay 12 below, Wainwright 17 below. So yeah, there's a lot of cold and stable air there. Single digit territory for most of Kotzebue Sound. Shishmaref went below zero there earlier today, 17 above in Nome, 9 in Unalakleet. McGrath was showing 6 degrees above zero, 1 in Healy. And as you get out toward Aniak, it was 9 degrees above, same as Bethel. Bristol Bay in the teens and 20s, the Alaska Peninsula in the upper 30s by and large, and 41 in Dutch Harbor in Alaska with the Pribilofs at 30 degrees and closing in on 40 degrees for the central and western Aleutians. You'll pretty much hold above freezing there tonight, with south and western Alaska anywhere from 0 to about 10 below. Norton Sound around Unalakleet about 0. Nome's looking at 6 below. Kotzebue Sound temperatures 5 to 15 below. The North Slope looks like 10 to 25 below. Most of the interior will be sub-zero tonight, anywhere from Fairbanks at about 20 below to as cold as 31 below in areas around Arctic Village. South Central at or below zero, especially Anchorage, Mat-Su, and with a little bit of wind, that's going to feel a lot worse. Prince William Sound Teens and perhaps some areas nudging up on 20 degrees. 24 in Kodiak. Southeast 20s and 30s tonight. A few areas still holding on to the 40s. You'll get back there tomorrow from Sitka southward along the coast. 30 in Juneau tomorrow. 21 in Haines and Skagway with heavy snow continuing. Teens and 20s tomorrow in South Central and the interior. 5 to 15 below. The exceptions of Arctic Village, Northway, and Eagle. Probably Greeley as well. The North Slope looking at 5 to 15 below. The Seward Peninsula probably above 0 south and west, including the YK Delta. Single digits tomorrow. 17 in Nunivak, St. Paul 29, and the Aleutians holding in the 30s. Flying weather tomorrow, as far as visibility, that should improve, but watch for some areas to have probably some very isolated or small-scale ground blizzards there with wind moving across. Again, we could have some wind issues tomorrow, just obscuring visibility for a short amount of time. Otherwise, MVFR across the Gulf Coast and south of Kodiak Island along the north side of the Aleutians and out across the western tip of the chain. Past conditions then, as you would expect, mainly VFR through the north and through the Alaska Range passes, including Rainy Pass and Windy Pass, all expected to be VFR throughout the day. Isabel Pass and also Mentasta Pass should see relatively clear skies. Tanita Pass, smooth sailing there. Porter's Pass, also VFR. And for the northern passes in southeast, look for some improvement gradually through the day. But again, heavy snow will be the rule through most of your Thursday. Freezing levels show that change taking shape as a cold air is overtaking all of mainland Alaska. You can see that white line moving farther and further south. And we don't have that overrunning situation that we saw last week that was producing many areas, even in the interior, freezing rain threat for south central included. So that again is shifted back to more of a normal type winter pattern with freezing levels at 2,000 to 4,000 feet across southern parts of southeast. Looking at the icing potential, anywhere from 9 to about 3,000 feet. We could have some light to isolated moderate icing. The main threat, though, is really shifted to our south at this point. The jet stream shows a trough of low pressure that is taking over Alaska in the upper levels there, allowing that cold air to just take over mainland Alaska out to the west. We saw that larger weather pattern a little while ago in the satellite picture. That's what it's doing, drawing up that stronger southerly flow west of the Kamchatka Peninsula, and cold air is across the extreme eastern parts of Siberia at this point. Low pressure just to the west of the Cook Inlet is wrapping in that colder air, being that vacuum, sucking in that colder and drier air from the north. So that's a weather situation at 9,000 feet. You can see that warm and wet air riding in on that southwesterly conveyor belt into southeastern Alaska and then pulling in that colder, drier continental flow across the Yukon and Kuskokwim valleys there all the way from the west coast into the Yukon itself. At 3,000 feet, a stronger weather pattern here with a stronger wind flow, I should say, from Fairbanks and points eastward. Wind speeds there crank up to about 50 to 70 knots. They slow down a little bit as they move over the YK Delta, but again, you can see that potential for stronger areas of turbulence, probably especially north of the Alaska Range, and it sounded like many people were reporting some of that today. The western eastern Gulf looking at some westerly winds between 25 and about 40 knots moving across the eastern Gulf at 3,000 feet. Turbulence potential then, we're going to have to mark some areas there, especially across the lower and mid-Yukon Valley, as isolated severe, occasional, probably widespread occasional turbulence south of the Brooks Range summits and north of the Alaska Range all the way out to the YK Delta, so watch it there. Even though the sky may be clear and the temperature's cold, the wind is certainly moving along and helping that to be possible, so do be careful and hold on to the yoke. Northern parts of the Gulf Coast, probably looking at some occasional moderate there around Prince William Sound and on the eastern side of the Kenai Peninsula, and also across parts of southeast, on top of it being relatively wintry and wet across many parts of the southeastern archipelago below 6,000 feet. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather here in just a few minutes.
Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm Jim Peranto. The National Weather Service Alaska region has 3 forecast offices strategically located throughout the state that provide weather, hydrologic, and climate forecasts for Alaska and its surrounding waters. One of those offices is located in Fairbanks. Today in the studio I have John Lingus, who is the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the Fairbanks Forecast Office, and he's going to tell us about his office and what kind of products and services it provides. Welcome to the studio, John.
Thank you, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. Can you give us a quick overview about the Fairbanks Forecast Office?
Sure can. The National Weather Service office in Fairbanks is located on the University of Alaska campus. We're actually renters and we take up part of a floor in the International Arctic Research Institute, or the Akasofu building, on the west ridge of the campus. we are co-located then with the Atmospheric Sciences Department of UAF, which is a great partnership there.
Yeah. And you're 24 hours?
We have 24-hour, 7-day-a-week forecast operations.
Okay. And the general products and services that you provide, what are those?
Well, there's 4 basic types. There are our public forecast products for our 26 weather zones across our northern Alaska, and that covers the land area. Those public forecasts are written in general terms for the overall public. We have marine forecasts that cover 9 marine zones, coastal marine zones that are in use by mariners across northern Alaska waters. And then we also write forecasts for 12 airport locations across northern Alaska. And those 3 types of forecasts are issued all the time, that is every day, several, 2 to 4 times a day. Then in the summer, actually beginning in as early as May and extending through August and once in a great while into September, we write fire weather forecasts for wildfire concerns, and especially for the land management agencies who are dealing with wildfire. And on top of all those programs, as needed, we write or we issue warnings and advisories for various weather hazards associated with any or all of these programs, these services, as needed and year-round.
What are some of the challenges that you have to endure for your area of responsibility?
Well, I guess one of the most obvious challenges, Jim, is that we have a large area to forecast for. You know, I overlaid this on a map of the lower 48, and it takes up about 10 Midwestern states, the area that we forecast for. We start at the crest of the Alaskan Range, we go all the way north of Barrow, we go from the Canadian border on the east side all the way to the Bering Strait. So it's a lot of real estate.
And a lot of weather happens within that real estate, right? So it's
Exactly.
challenging for the forecasters.
You know, sometimes, weather patterns are quiet. We might only get one weather system affecting the area. Other times, when it's very active, we could get 3 or 4 different weather systems affecting our total area. We've got just a lot to look at, a lot to cover, and we have a lot more observations now than we did 20 years ago, but there's still vast areas without weather information. So.
What are some of the unique weather forecasts that you're putting out of your office?
Well, one of the forecasts we began back in the late 90s was a recreational forecast for Mount McKinley. And it's really geared to the upper elevations of the mountain, starting at about 7,000 feet. We have it broken into several layers there in general, and we write some specific forecasts for those layers for the first about 24 hours, like a first 12-hour period and the second 12-hour period. And then we write also a outlook for the next 3 days after that. And we do this at basically to serve not only the public on the mountain, but also we align it specifically with the National Park Service and their ranger program on the mountain that begins in early May and then ends in mid-July. So we try to align it with those types of needs. And one of the things we found out about this forecast is, although we can try to provide some detailed information, but mountain weather is highly variable and it changes a lot. But what we found the most useful is the outlook section where their trends are forecast, and that's very critical to planning on the mountain.
Are you doing any experimental forecasts?
Funny you should ask, Jim. Actually, we started over last winter to develop a product called the Offshore Forecast for the Arctic Waters. And our coastal waters forecasts go out 60 miles, so if you can imagine where that 60 miles ends north of the Arctic coast. Then from that point on, about 100 miles north, we have the Arctic waters, offshore waters forecast, and we divided that area into 3 zones. And it is seasonal. We start at once one of those 3 zones becomes ice-free. It would appear to be normally the western zone. And that begins, like this year, for the first time, was in early July. And then as the other zones become at least like 50% ice-free, we then add those in. Now this year we only had forecasts for the western zone and the middle zone. The eastern zone never got sufficiently ice-free enough. And then just a couple weeks ago, actually probably within the last week of about November, mid-November, we ended the forecast because the zones had iced up sufficiently then.
Okay. The Storm Ready program, that's a National Weather Service program. You're involved with that. Can you just touch a little bit on the program and how you're using that in your office?
Well, right now we have 2 communities that are storm ready, Nome and McGrath. And we just look forward to working with other communities. We've touched base with some of them and given information out, and we know that there's several communities desirous of becoming storm ready. So
And what does it mean to be storm ready?
Well, you know, it really means, I term it as an opportunity to discover how you're prepared to handle weather hazards. That's basically in a nutshell. And so it's a lot about discovering what you already have in place, maybe finding a few things that you need to add. You put those in, and then you can become storm ready. It's a voluntary program. It's just a way to become prepared in a certain way for weather hazards.
Great, that's wonderful. John, thank you for coming into the studio today and imparting all this wonderful knowledge to us. We'll have to have you again soon. Don't be a stranger.
All right.
For you folks out there who would like to know more about the Fairbanks Forecast Office, they have a wonderful website. It's weather.gov/Fairbanks. If you type that in on your browser, you'll go to their forecast website, and you'll be able to see a lot of the information that we talked about here in the interview. Thank you again, John, for coming in.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us here on Alaska Weather Facts. Until next time.
And now a quick look at the sea ice edge as analyzed by our sea ice experts in the sea ice program in Anchorage today. You're looking at the Bering Strait and saying, wow, that looks pretty close, like it's going to close off. Well, chances are probably sometime early next week is when we'll see that freeze up there. A large area there in the Chukchi Sea is somewhat open right now, but with stronger northerly winds developing, it'll probably freeze very quickly, if not flash freeze, as we head into early parts of next week. You want to see maps like this and get the tools you need to overlay some of the areas that have ice. You can certainly do that by going to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice.php, and all the tools should be there for you. Looking in southeast, the winds are going to stay up across the Lynn Canal tomorrow. A northerly wind going at 40 knots or so, producing gales with 9-foot seas expected there. Across some parts of the central and southern interchannels, winds will be around 30 knots. You notice more of that southerly flow, though, across the southern third of southeast. That's going to keep that warm air in place. Meanwhile, where you have northerly winds, that's going to be snow across Haines and Skagway and Yakutat, even with the northeasterly flow and a 14-foot sea offshore. As you look at south central Alaska for Friday, apparently we've skipped a couple maps here. We're going to work through it there. A northeasterly flow continues across Prince William Sound. The northeasterly is offshore of Seward and Homer, around 35 knots with a 9-foot sea. Freezing spray is going to be a problem for the Cook Inlet and also around Kodiak Island, the Barren Islands, and Kamishak Bay, so be prepared for that. Chances are we're going to go back to south central here. Yeah, look at that. See? The computer's having fun with me today. A north and northeasterly flow for Thursday, 15 to 20 knots there in the western Gulf. North and westerly flow coming across Kodiak Island with 20-knot winds and 4 to 8-foot seas. Again, freezing spray. And watch this. Here's a little deja vu for you. Have you seen that? Wow, this is all sorts of fun today. It says Thursday, but now it should be Friday. So we're going to skip past that. You already saw that. What you should note, though, across south central and southeast, the winds should be subsiding somewhat as we get into Thursday and Friday, and the freezing spray issue will remain a threat across south central and maybe even northern parts of the Gulf as well. Here's the Alaska Peninsula pattern here, and 20 to 30 knot wind coming across the Bering Sea side, 6 to 11 foot seas with freezing spray there, and also on the Pacific side, 20 to 30 knot winds from King Cove out toward the western tip of Kodiak Island. 6 to 8 foot seas are expected there. And as we get into Friday, wow, we are all sorts of weird tonight. North and northeasterly flow going across the Bering Sea side, and you'll also notice across the northern parts of the Pacific, 25 to 30 knot winds there, 12 to 14 foot seas are expected. More of an easterly flow on Friday. I have no idea what map's coming up next, so let's just see. Hey, Thursday, why not? A northeasterly flow coming across the central and eastern Aleutians, 6 to 10 foot seas. Seas are building on Thursday now, and I really apologize for these being so out of order today. A northeasterly flow north of Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, 12 foot seas there, 35 knot winds south of Unalaska and Nikolsky. Freezing spray an issue here across the eastern Aleutians, not so much across the central and western islands. And once again, let's just push the magic button, see what comes up. Hey, Friday, why not? 25 to 35 knot winds across the central and eastern parts of the chain, and 12 to 14 foot seas there from Adak, Akka, and then south of Nikolsky there, 12 to 14 foot seas. And again, still that north and easterly flow across the west and west central Aleutians. Hey, the west map, right where it should be. A northeasterly flow coming off the continent will keep wind speeds around 25 to 35 knots. Seas still running 9 to about 10 feet there closer to the coastline. The Pribilof's a 12 foot sea, and freezing spray all the way up into the Bering Strait there by Thursday. This is feeling good. A northerly flow coming out of the Bering Strait, keeping it cold with freezing spray. Still a threat, 30 to 35 knots. Let's check the north slope. Yes. Looks like light winds and somewhat variable flow from Barrow all the way out toward Prudhoe Bay. Ice still in place here, but not filled in just yet around areas north of the Bering Strait. 15 to 20 knot winds from the north and east with a 3 to 4 foot sea. Yeah, there we go. Finishing on a good note. 5 to 10 foot knot winds there across the Beaufort Seacoast. Light winds all the way out to Barrow, and then there's that northerly push that we were talking about. That's going to really help to form up the ice across the Chukchi Sea. Recapping tonight's weather, right as it should be. Low pressure across the north and eastern Gulf Coast, keeping some heavy snow across southeast. Blizzard conditions on the Klondike Highway, and winter storm warnings elsewhere in the northern parts of southeast. Enjoy your evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.